Okay, it's a great pleasure to welcome you to this rich session on musical imperialism's form of domination and ambition. And I expect us to find points of resonance between the considerations of turn of the 18th century London's music culture and its intersections with the slave trade and colonialism, 1960s European refusals of the term jazz as a prop for white supremacy, and the ways in which popular music about Vienna's woods at 1900 engaged Vienna's musical imaginary and its identity as a Musikstadt. All three papers dig into deeply rooted conceptions of European identity and their intersections with music. But before we start, I'm sure there will be a few audience members with questions. And so I'm just going to ask you that after the paper is finished, each paper is finished, we'll have a question period that you can just post your name or your question in the chat, and then we will work through them and sort of invite you to open your mic in the order that they appear. Okay, so to start, I am very pleased to introduce Eric Coutts, who after a 35 career in law and finance, he completed his PhD in musicology at King's College London in 2025 under the supervision of Professor Cliff Eisen. His research covers musical life in 18th century London with a special interest in the impact of legal and commercial influences on musicians between 1750 and 1775. He has presented papers at a number of international conferences, including those organized by the Royal Musical Association, the Ira F. Brilliant Center for Beethoven Studies, San Diego, the University of Valencia, and the University of the Arts Helsinki History Forum, and the Sibelius Academy. Eric, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thank you very much, Linda. Can everybody hear me? That's the first question. And I'm now going to attempt to share my presentation. Let's see if this works. By the turn of the 19th century, London was the largest city in Europe and, with the possible exception of Edo, that is Tokyo, and Peking, in the world. An estimated population of 575,000 in 1700 grew to 675,000 by 1750 and had reached around 900,000 by the end of the century. The culture of taste in 18th century England was increasingly built upon the connection between culture and commerce, and it became difficult to gain recognition as a member of the cultured class without money and status. Aristocrats, financiers, and wealthy tradesmen migrated with their families to the capital during the season, the period from February to June, to conduct parliamentary and other official business, and increasingly to enjoy what Joseph Addison and others described at the time as the pleasures of the imagination. Music, then, as now, featured prominently among those pleasures. There were something like 1,500 musicians in London in 1750, and numbers increased still further with new arrivals from continental Europe, encouraged by the potential for financial success and the absence of centralized control over artistic affairs. Depending upon taste and budget, music could be enjoyed at over 100 different venues, including Italian opera performed by the leading global singers of the day, concerts and oratorios in assembly halls and private mansions, musical interludes at the theatre, extravagant outdoor performances in the pleasure gardens, and private performances organized by musical societies or to accompany fashionable soirees. On 12 March 1765, Lady Clive wrote to her husband Robert, recently appointed governor of Bengal, to describe preparations for a concert to be held at their home in Berkeley Square in the West End of London. And I quote, "Tomorrow I shall have a great deal of company indeed, all the people of quality, etc. I am on an intimate footing with, or that like me in music, to hear Manzoli sing here, accompanied by Mr. Burton on the harpsichord, on which the little Mozarts, the boy aged 8 and the girl 12, will also play most completely well, and this together with 2 good fiddlers and a bass." End quote. Private musical soirees were becoming increasingly fashionable in the West End. They not only reflected elite taste, but also served to reinforce the social hierarchies of the period, in adding an extra level of exclusivity to the already limited circle able to afford admission to performances at the King's Opera and the West End subscription series. Lady Clive's letter was brought to light by Ian Woodfield in a 1995 article, which is frequently cited as evidence of the Mozart children's participation in private concerts during the family's stay in London between April 1764 and July 1765. However, today I want to draw attention to another aspect of Lady Clive's letter, namely the association of concert patronage in later 18th century London with wealth derived from colonial exploitation and the slave trade. Margaret Clive and the people of quality that formed the audience for her concert were at the centre of this intersection of culture and commerce. Lord Clive, widely acknowledged as having established the British East India Company's foothold in Bengal, had amassed an extraordinary fortune during his time in India. The acquisition in 1761 of the couple's residence at 45 Berkeley Square, purchased outright for £10,500, a sum broadly equivalent to $26 to $40 million today, underscores the immense wealth flowing from colonial ventures. Clive had left for his third and final posting to India in 1764, the year before the planned concert. On his return to England 3 years later, he and his wife faced controversy over the manner by which they had acquired their wealth. By the early 1770s, criticism of the operations conducted by the East India Company had escalated to a state of moral panic at the perception of an Eastern plunder that had corrupted British politics. A House of Commons Select Committee reporting in May 1773 went so far as to note that Robert Clive had, quote, abused the powers with which he was entrusted to the evil example of the servants of the public, end quote. However, the committee proceeded to acknowledge that Robert Lord Clive did, at the same time, render great and meritorious services to his country. This duality of approach reflects the complex ambiguity surrounding the legacy of wealth derived from colonialisation and the slave trade and its influence on the cultural and social landscape of 18th century London. The connection between Britain's first industrial revolution and the country's leading role in slave trading is now firmly established. The topic was first tackled directly in 1944 by Eric Williams with the publication of his landmark work, Capitalism and Slavery. Careful to avoid suggestion that slavery caused the Industrial Revolution, or that slavery was necessary for its development, Williams nevertheless demonstrated that the British economy rested in large part upon the reinvestment of the profits derived from the slave trade. An important recent reassessment of Williams's work concludes that the impact of the slave trade extended well beyond industrialization and the British economy. In Slavery, Capitalism and the Industrial Revolution, published in 2023, Maxine Berg and Pat Hudson find that the role of slavery in the process of industrialization and economic transformation in the early 18th and early 19th centuries has been generally underestimated by historians. They conclude, and I quote, "The slave and plantation trades were the hub around which many other dynamic and innovatory sectors of the economy pivoted. Slavery, directly and indirectly, set in motion innovations in manufacturing, agriculture, wholesaling, retailing, shipping, banking, international trade, finance and investment, insurance, as well as in the organization and intensification of work, record keeping, and the application of scientific and useful knowledge." End of quote. But it is Simon Gikandi who most comprehensively addresses how the complex interaction between the slave trade and polite society shaped British identity and culture and the nation's social mores. In his 2014 study, Slavery and the Culture of Taste, Gikandi concludes that despite their positioning at opposite ends of the cultural spectrum, and I quote, "both the institution of slavery and culture of taste were fundamental in the shaping of modern identity, and that they did so not apart, but as non-identical twins, similar yet different." He cites Edward Said, who calls for the study of slavery and taste to be conducted in a contrapuntal manner, as both were, and I quote, "in their functions and effect, processes that took place at the same time in the same place and hence need to be considered within the economy of what Frederick Jameson terms expressive causality, the process by which two distinct regions of social life, even when structurally unconnected, can still be considered to be part of some general identity, especially at the phenomenological level." End of quote. A critical element of Ghicandi's analysis is that preoccupation with the nation-state as the framework for historical narrative disguised the reality of the slave trade. Its physical occurrence elsewhere than on English soil enabled historians and the British national consciousness to confine the issue to the historiography of the Americas. The point is well made by Catherine Hall in her introduction to a collection of essays entitled Legacies of British Slave Ownership. And I quote, "Slave ownership is virtually invisible in British history. It has been elided by strategies of euphemism and evasion originally adopted by the slave owners themselves and subsequently reproduced widely in British culture." End of quote. Now, despite extensive commentary on contemporary sponsorship of the arts by petrochemical groups, gaming companies, and pharmaceutical organizations, I believe that the influence of the slave trade on the financing of 18th century musical life is a largely unexplored example of the type of contrapuntal study that Ghikandi insists demands attention. Musicologists have, of course, discussed new cultural history for some 50 years now, but a great deal of scholarship continues to relegate social issues to the background of focus on composers and performers as creative artists. In particular, financial and legal influences, if discussed at all, are generally considered to be incidental to the primary biographical narrative. I argue that close examination of concurrent social, economic, and legal developments presents a more nuanced picture. I attach particular importance to the aesthetics of audience reception in 18th century concert culture and initiate a prosopographic analysis of subscription lists to the Bach-Abel subscription concerts, the longest running and most influential West End concert series of the later 18th century. In addition to preeminent aristocrats, landowners, politicians, scientists, surgeons, artists, and actors, the lists include members of powerful business families, and I conduct a preliminary assessment of key individuals with connections to the slave trade and colonial exploitation. David Hunter, one of the few academics that has written on the subject, notes an unwillingness to envision the ecologies and economies of music and slavery as being intertwined. By focusing on aesthetic matters and so-called reception studies, music historians have overlooked the economic base upon which the musical world was constructed. He laments Handel's involvement with the Royal African Company in the early 18th century as, and I quote, "an appalling conjunction of the finest art and the worst of humanity." But my objective today is not to pass judgment. Repugnant as we find the issue today, one must recognize that it was common and widely accepted practice for wealthy families and investors to participate in the slave-based economy, even in the later 18th century. It is noteworthy, for example, that composers themselves treated the theme of slavery as a dramatic rather than as an economic or moral issue. However, I believe it remains important to understand the sources of wealth behind London's musical life and the extent of its dependence on the economics of the slave trade and colonial expansion. My initial analysis suggests that around 7 to 8% of the families listed in the Bach-Abel subscription list profited from the slave trade and colonial plantations, a percentage that is probably understated given that the number of further credible links identified but for which specific evidence is lacking. Compensation records suggest that 5 to 10% of national elites in British society can be connected to the slave trade, a percentage which corresponds to Hunter's estimation that around 9% of the 700 families who subscribed to the London Opera between 1789 and 97 had ties to the slave economy. Examples of subscribers in the Bach-Abel subscription list with connections to the slave economy and wealth built on colonial exploitation include some of London's most powerful trading families. I will touch on 5 examples today. Mrs. Beckford. The Beckford family was among the wealthiest slave-owning and slave-trading dynasties. Its fortune was built upon sugar plantations in Jamaica, which were worked by thousands of enslaved Africans under extremely violent conditions. By the 1770s, the Beckfords collectively owned over 22,000 acres of plantations in Jamaica and upwards of 3,000 enslaved Africans across their estates. Lady Blair. Mary Blair was the wife of Charles Blair, and incidentally, the great-great-grandmother of George Orwell. The Blair family had built significant wealth from several sugar and coffee plantations and landholdings. Lord and Lady Blair were absentee planters. They lived in Wimpole Street, but managed and profited from slave labour overseas. Surviving documents show very high death rates that were characteristic of Jamaican sugar estates, a continued need to renew the labour force through new purchases of enslaved Africans, and the use of violent coercive discipline, including whippings and the use of irons and stocks. Lady Dowager Cunliffe was a highly connected London hostess and a recognised patroness of the arts and polite sociability. Frances Burney's diaries present her as refined, mild, and of gracious sociability. In contrast, Lady Cunliffe's husband, Sir Ellis Cunliffe, was a shipowner and financier in the Atlantic slave trade and one of the largest slave trading investors in Liverpool during the 1740s and 1760s. He invested in voyages that sailed to West Africa to purchase enslaved Africans, transported them to the Caribbean and American colonies, and then traded them in return for sugar, rum, cotton for sale in Britain. Sir Ellis represented pro-slavery commercial interests in his capacity as Member of Parliament for Liverpool between 1755 and 1768. The duo George Drake and Beeston Long were London-based merchants and the controlling partners of a major slave economy finance house that operated in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. The business provided credit and insurance services to support slave plantations across the Caribbean. And finally, Lady Mary Stapleton. The Stapletons' family wealth was derived from major sugar plantations in the Leeward Islands dating back to the 17th century. Lady Stapleton married Sir Thomas Stapleton, 5th Baronet and MP for Oxford, and together they managed the estates from the family's estate, Grace Court, in Oxfordshire. So in conclusion, one might ask, why does this matter? After all, most 18th century social and leisure activities were financially supported in some form by colonial and plantation investments, and music was no exception. However, understanding the extent to which musical life depended on the slave economy is important. John Brewer describes high culture as, quote, less a set of discrete works of art than a phenomenon shaped by circles of conversation and criticism formed by its creators, distributors, and consumers, end quote. In directing attention away from composers towards consideration of new ways in which urban music was commercialized and who was consuming it, we move from the supply side of music towards recognition of the aesthetics of audience reception. Drawing on Hans Robert Strauss's conception of the horizon of expectations, this approach emphasizes that listening is historically conditioned and interprets meaning as something co-produced by performers and listeners within specific spaces. We gain a better perspective on the manner in which musicians adapted to changing concert audiences and critically how social identities, listener expectations, and performance environments together shaped what music was understood to mean. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. It was just a really beautiful and well-conceived paper. Yeah, I will wait for people to put some notes in the chat if they would like to speak or a question. But in the meantime, I will, as chair, take this opportunity to float two questions for you. First of all, I'm wondering if you could talk to, share your thoughts on us about how your background in law has brought new sights to the study of music and culture, just in general, but also in London specifically. And also, I'm just sort of fascinated by how the economy of slavery lurks behind musical cultures. And you referred on a number of occasions in your talk to the importance of the urban context of London concert life. And I'm just wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on that.
Sure. So on the legal side, I think actually, my background is law and finance, and I spent over 25 years working with major international banks. And I think that the combination, in fact, of my dissertation is based on the title is Patronage, Commerce and Copyright. And I think that there was an interaction between patronage and commerce, and then copyright created effectively a product which composers could then eventually sell. So if we wanted to bookend it, you could say that in 1750, I look at 1750 to 1775. If we wanted to bookend it, 1759 was when Handel died, and he was pretty much the last of the sort of composers in London that was provided with major support from the royal court. And then in 1773, Johann Christian Bach, so the youngest son of Johann Sebastian Bach, brought a law case in London where musical copyright was recognized for the first time anywhere in the world. So within that 25-year period, there was a dramatic change. And so I think my legal background and my financial background helps provide an external view, which is perhaps a little different from musicologists who have a much more sort of, let's say, centered vision of music as an independent art form. That's summarizing it very crudely, but that's basically the point. And then on the urban side, I think that's really important. Even in the 1750s, culture and commerce were presented as natural partners. People like Oliver Goldsmith and David Hume said that you needed an assembly of ideas and money and talent together to create culture. Oliver Goldsmith says that basically when you have, it talked about a large university where lots of ideas are intermingled and where people study life and not logic, as he put it. And I think that ties in very much with what Reinhard Strom wrote about in 15th century Bruges and the idea of the urbanization of culture. And I think the idea of money and people being focused centered on development and capitalization is very much tied into music. And again, my dissertation was very much based on the idea of not treating music as an independent, separate art form, but as something that's very tied into that.
Well, thank you. It's a very welcome contribution to the discipline. And I'd be really curious to see if collaborations between you and maybe musicologists who are focused on the music would be beneficial or fruitful in this case. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts there.
Sure, yes. Well, in fact, one of my examiners, I had two examiners. I had Simon McVeigh and Simon Keefe. And Simon McVeigh, of course, is the preeminent expert on what happened in concert life in London in the later 18th century. And he is very focused on some of the financial aspects and the legal aspects. And I think, well, we'll see, but I think it would be nice to do a little bit more work with him on that.
Hey, well, thank you so much. If there are any other questions, now is a good time to bring them in. And if not, then we will move along. But we'll just give you a round of applause and great thanks for what was a lovely paper. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, wonderful. Well, we'll move to our second speaker. Floris Schuiling is assistant professor at Utrecht University. He received his PhD from the University of Cambridge in 2015 for his study of Amsterdam-based improvising collective, the Instant Composers Pool, and their use of notations in an improvised musical practice. And I just want to give a note to the AMS people that are running this session. At the moment, Eric is pinned, and we actually need Floris to be pinned. So this work resulted in a book published by Routledge in 2019. He previously received a Venny grant from the Dutch Research Council for a project reconsidering the role of notation in musical practice, results of which have appeared in the Journal of the Royal Musical Association, Music Theory Online, and Music and Letters. And he currently leads the Improdeco project on improvised music and decolonization, investigating jazz and improvised music in the Netherlands from a decolonial perspective. So welcome, Floris.
Thank you so much, Linda. And thanks very much to the conference organizers for making this online session possible. I appreciate that very much. On Idiom and the Whiteness of Improvisation, my paper presents some results from a research project on whiteness in European free improvisation. A music that emerged in Western Europe in the 1960s from the influence of American free jazz on a new generation of European avant-garde musicians. I am interested in how the label of how the refusal of the label jazz, perceived as an implicit stylistic limitation to true musical freedom, reinstates whiteness at the heart of the concept of improvisation. My work builds on George Lewis's idea of Afrological and Eurological perspectives on improvisation, and particularly his suggestion that acts of exnomination, or the refusal of names, serve to uphold white supremacy in music historiography. This logic is best exemplified in the concept of non-idiomatic music, a term coined by British improvising guitarist Derek Bailey, and since then widely adopted as a name for this music that refuses to be named. Exnomination is at the heart of the idea of non-idiomaticity. Bailey only provides a negative definition, writing that non-idiomatic means that there is no expression of idiom, and the term idiom is left undefined. Many of Bailey's examples of idiomatic musics are racialized others, while non-idiomatic music is presented as a universal practice. Such as in this quote, it's presented as a kind of musical state of nature, not only the origin of all music, but equally the true fulfillment of music's inner potential. To use a concept of Johannes Fabian, this chronopolitics simultaneously confines improvisation to a kind of eternalized past and constructs a space for white European improvisers to truly innovate and drive music history forward. This reading of Bailey can be corroborated by looking at the emergence of improvised music around 1970. My research focuses especially on the Netherlands, where improvised music has been a particularly successful genre. The improvising collective, the Instant Composers Pool, or ICP, founded in 1967, has been the main force behind this scene, not just because of their music, but also through their political organization, which led to the foundation of the BIM Improvisers Union, and the establishment of government funding programs for improvised music. In an advertisement for the ICP, published in 1970, Michel Mengelberg praises Black Power for having, quote, loosened the chains of meter and tonality. Although the text as a whole is heavily laced with irony, and this comment should be understood as at least partly tongue-in-cheek, it makes explicit a modernist framework in which Dutch improvisers and critics understood the Black American avant-garde. Their appreciation for jazz was expressed in purely musical terms, and free jazz was seen as the most advanced form of music according to Eurocentric criteria. It was an appreciation of jazz despite its connections to Black history, culture, and politics. This conditionality became clear when the Black American avant-garde increasingly turned towards more Afrocentric and spiritualist orientations, while broadening their musical palette to include more recognizable jazz idioms, various forms of non-Western traditional music, as well as contemporary funk and other kinds of popular idioms. To Dutch musicians and critics, mostly white Marxist intellectuals, the idea that truth was marching in, that the creator had a master plan, or that music is the healing force of the universe, meant very little compared to what they saw as the more generic revolutionary calls for freedom in earlier free jazz. Rudy Koopmans, who was the most prominent jazz critic at the time and closely involved with the founding of both the ICP and later the Improvisers Union, wrote extensively about what he could only see as a contradiction. In 1969, in a whopping 7-page review of Albert Ayler's album Newgrass, he ruminates at length whether Ayler's use of hymns and marches was meant to be ironic or not, and how his allusions to Christian spirituality relate to the democratic ethos of free jazz. He clearly saw such spirituality not as an integral part of free jazz, but as a contamination of the true essence of the music. Referring to it as populism and escapism, he concluded that it's all meaningless, of course, but it's pretty music nonetheless. Other critics followed suit. Martin Schoute referred a year later to what he saw as a lot of cosmological and spiritual claptrap to justify the intellectual laziness of free jazz musicians. B.H. Winkels discussed the religious themes on Pharoah Sanders' album Jewels of Thought, assuring the listener that, quote, the music is of such a nature that the listener need not worry whether they've read enough of the Bible, Quran, or I Ching, unquote, arguing that the quality of the album is because of, quote, the music itself, and that the Quran can remain safely on the shelf. In the same issue, ICP founder and drummer Han Benning described Albert Eiler's Newgrass, Sanders' Jewels of Thought, and various other recent free jazz albums as pandering to the tastes of the audience, stating that American jazz musicians had stopped innovating and that the most innovative music was now coming from the Netherlands. Both critics and musicians around 1970 then upheld a modernist conception of musical innovation. This stands at direct consequences for the institutionalization of this music. When the Improvisers Union, the BIM, was founded, Michel Mengelberg became its first president. In the very first board meeting, he proposed to restrict the meaning of the term improviser to mean modern or contemporary. Although this proposal was ultimately voted down, it was clear to everyone that the BIM was mainly founded to defend the interests of avant-garde musicians. Mengelberg and other BIM members would not have seen this in terms of anti-blackness. Their main adversaries were white Dutch straight-ahead jazz musicians who made an income playing radio and television gigs, and in their view did not need funding to support their art. Nonetheless, the label of modern or contemporary improvisation set a highly arbitrary condition that did exclude people who might in fact need their support, and one that implicitly privileged white musicians. Around 1980, various black jazz musicians active in the Netherlands, mainly from recently independent Suriname, started to criticize the policies of the BIM, as well as its associated concert venue, the Bimhuis. Rudy Koopmans described some of the debates about the Bimhuis programming before attending to this particular critique. Quote, "A much uglier critique recently came from the Surinamese and Antillean direction. Black musicians supposedly get too few chances in the Bimhuis. The problem, however, has nothing to do with skin color, but with something else entirely. There are no Surinamese or Antillean jazz musicians. They make Surinamese music, sometimes mixed with reggae, calypso, or steel band music. The Bimhuis is set up to be a center for contemporary improvised music and not for Latin." It's somewhat astonishing that one of the country's foremost jazz critics would claim that there were no Surinamese or Antillean jazz musicians who had been part of the Dutch jazz world since the 1920s. The final sentence very clearly performs an act of exnomination, referring to the contemporaneity of improvised music in contrast to what is quickly and rather carelessly dubbed Latin. In an interview with some Surinamese musicians 3 years later, they make clear how these ideas affected their livelihoods. Flutist Ronald Snijders emphasizes that this music was not taken seriously. Quote, "The Dutch musician does not completely accept the Caribbean style of improvising. He sees it as a form of entertainment." End quote. Later in the conversation, bassist Vincent Heenaar says that this also has consequences for the allocation of BIM funding. Quote, "For Frafra Sound, I've requested funding without any success, because people assume that we don't make improvised music, but salsa. Salsa is a catch-all term for all kinds of things, but I don't consider my music salsa." End quote. These comments from Snijders and Heenaar raise the question, what exactly is an idiom? Jonathan de Souza's recent work on the idiomaticity of harmonicas and guitars argues that idiom is the result of an interplay between an instrument's construction and the player's socially conditioned habits. He connects this to the philosophical work of Bernard Stiegler, whose work theorizes a general organology that describes the co-constitutive relation between techniques, social institutions, and the human. Idiom plays a central role in Stiegler's philosophy, which is principally opposed to any ideas of a state of nature. In the technical and social organization of human existence, idiom, for Stiegler, is the expression of what he calls the improbable ways in which humans double up on their programming. This individuation is what enables temporality, sociality, and knowledge. In this perspective, idiom is aligned with improvisation rather than opposed to it. In fact, an early text by Stiegler takes Charlie Parker exemplary of idiomaticity. However, in light of my previous discussion, Stiegler's work is notably devoid of any consideration of coloniality. His historical frame of reference is almost archaically Eurocentric. One of his examples of individuation is Athenian democracy, in which the technology of writing made possible an isonomia of Athenian citizens, which enabled a new form of autonomy through idiomatic differentiation. Nor does Stiegler consider that this isonomia, or sameness before the law, only apply to free adult non-immigrant men. Stiegler built his philosophy on the myth of Epimetheus, who forgot the human when the gods assigned to him the distribution of attributes over the animals. To Stiegler, Epimetheus represents the repression of technology in the history of philosophy, but as a figure without attributes, he can also be understood as a representation of what Charles Mills has called white ignorance. As Mills's concept of the racial contract suggests, the isonomia that Stiegler theorizes constitutes a form of exclusion and dispossession that his theory of idiom does not account for. Precisely this point of dispossession is raised by Jacques Derrida, who was Stiegler's mentor, when he writes, "I only have one language, it is not mine." This aphorism is repeated like a refrain throughout his monolingualism of the other, in which Derrida makes clear how his history as a post-colonial subject, first under French and later under German occupation, shaped his relation to the French language, and implicitly his entire philosophical project. This aspect of Derrida's work, in which idiom does not only mark the achievement of individuation but simultaneously a form of dispossession, is an important influence on Fred Moten. Across his writings, Moten defines idiom as an origine and formal impropriety, a range of unoriginal differences that he relates both to Charles Kyle's concept of participatory discrepancies and to his and Stefano Harni's concept of the undercommons. It is from this understanding of idiom that I want to discuss the relation between idiom, improvisation, and freedom in three short musical examples, each representing a distinct post-colonial migrant community in the Netherlands. My first example is a very obscure recording made in 1955 by the so-called Vliemax Quartet, consisting of Flip Willemse, Max Lim, Dick van der Capelle, and Han de Jonge. I mentioned earlier that Dutch free improvisers in the 1960s would firmly distinguish themselves from white straight-ahead jazz musicians whom they saw as commercial imitators of black music. However, modern jazz in the Netherlands was not exclusively a white scene, but it included many musicians of mixed Dutch and Indonesian descent. During Dutch colonial rule, there was a strict race-based segregation system in place, in which these so-called Indos of mixed descent were legally considered Dutch and thus enjoyed greater privileges than the indigenous Indonesians. During the Japanese occupations, they were held in Japanese internment camps, just like white Europeans, and during and after the Indonesian Independence War, many were violently persecuted as traitors to Indonesia. In this period, up to 100,000 Indos were so-called repatriated to the Netherlands, a country that most of them had never been before. All the musicians on this recording, except Han de Jonge, had moved from Indonesia to the Netherlands during the Indonesian Independence War. Whereas in Indonesia they'd been seen as more or less equal to the Dutch, in the Netherlands they were often seen as unwelcome foreigners and faced substantial discrimination. I'll play you a short clip. Now, as you can hear, this sounds pretty much like regular 1950s jazz. Jazz was very widespread in Southeast Asia, and it was also very popular amongst the Dutch colonial elite, and so Indos in particular would hear a lot of jazz in the 1930s. In the Netherlands, Indo communities developed a particular nostalgia for colonial Indonesia, and jazz is surprisingly often part of their reminiscing about that time. The Japanese outlawed jazz as a Western influence, and after independence, President Sukarno also prohibited jazz. From the perspective of these Indos in the Netherlands, jazz symbolized a modern, Western, yet significantly non-white cultural identity. Far from being a simple imitation of a given idiom, then, for these Indos, jazz was marked with a particular history of individuation and dispossession. My second example is by Frafra Sound, a Surinamese band that briefly came up earlier. I'll just play it first. Sorry, it's very good. We heard the piece Kulembanwan, which is a composition by Kid Dynamite, who was a very successful Surinamese musician in the Netherlands in the 1930s. As jazz was becoming a very popular music in the Netherlands in the 1930s, it was also perceived through a very strongly racialized lens. So much so that jazz became strongly associated with Surinamese musicians, despite a general awareness of the music's origins in the United States. For the few Surinamese musicians active in the Netherlands, this meant a good opportunity to make a living, even if it meant performing in highly exoticized and sometimes downright denigrating circumstances. Kid Dynamite already combined jazz influences with calypso and other Caribbean musics, as well as elements from the Afro-Surinamese Winti traditions. By reinterpreting his music, which had largely been forgotten in the second half of the 20th century, Frafra sound connects to the history of Surinamese jazz musicians in the Netherlands, while adding further connections to the Black Atlantic through the sounds of funk and fusion, as well as Surinamese Kaseko. My final example is by a group led by Monica Akihari and Niels Brouwer. Akihari is a Moluccan singer, and this recording is taken from an album featuring traditional songs from Maluku. Maluku is a group of islands in current Indonesia with its own languages and cultural traditions. When Indonesian nationalists started fighting for independence, Moluccans wanted to claim their own independent state. They struck a devil's bargain with the Dutch colonizers and fought on the sides of the Dutch East Indies Army against the independence movement. After Indonesia became independent, over 10,000 Moluccans who fought for the Dutch were brought to the Netherlands, again with the promise that the Dutch government would help them become independent. These exiled Moluccans were long held in Dutch camps, including some former concentration camps, mostly without Dutch citizenship, and only in the course of the 1960s did the Dutch government start assigning them proper housing, leading to separate Moluccan neighborhoods all across the Netherlands, many of which still exist.
Sawa tu yando yo, sawa tu yando maule, limbe to maina, sawa tu la te limbe to maina, sawa tu la te limbe tu yando yo.
Derrida's aphorism is particularly salient in the case of Moluccan communities. The Molucca region includes many different islands, which all have their own languages and cultural traditions, many of which are starting to be forgotten. Among Moluccans in the Netherlands, there is a very real sense of indigenous culture being lost. Traditional songs constitute an important vehicle for both language and culture, but with time, melodies and texts inevitably change, and the meaning of some songs is not always clear to those who sing them. This album is based on a collection of field recordings that Akihari came across. These recordings contain various songs that she knew from her childhood, but with quite different melodies and especially different texts than she'd been taught. The group interprets these songs very freely, and in her vocal improvisations, Akihari improvises on the basis of these half-forgotten traditional Maluku languages. In conclusion, there we go. In conclusion, I want to consider what I've started to call the coloniality of improvisation. As we know, improvisation is strongly tied to notions of otherness, and in that sense, it's always been a Eurocentric idea. The idea of a free, non-idiomatic form of improvisation, however, suggests that it's also a way to perform whiteness. Stephen Greenblatt and John Corbett have previously described how improvisation and musical experimentation are conceptually connected to colonial expansion. In this paper, I've suggested further colonial tendencies, such as the chronopolitics of innovation and the link between improvisation and white ignorance. Against its coloniality of non-idiomaticity, I consider that I suggest that we understand idiom as a form of undercommoning, or as a way of remembering after a colonial dismemberment. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Floris. Yeah, what riveting material you're working on. It's very exciting. I'm going to just give everyone a moment to pop their, I'm sure there will be questions into the chat. And, is that what they recommend, that we wait 10 seconds for people to gather their thoughts? But I guess I can lead with my own question, and it deals with the reception of the music, in terms of who are the audiences for these different types of music, and does that reception of the music reflect the sort of institutional ways people are that you described, where people are Dutch or not Dutch, or does the reception of this music fall along those lines, or does it sort of disrupt that institutional messaging, or yeah?
Which music are you referring?
Well, you've introduced a lot of different types of music or at different time periods, and you could just pick one maybe that you have floated, and I'm just curious, are a group that is doing something that is not considered jazz, do their audiences also not consider it jazz, or do the audiences define the music in the same way that the musicians are, or that the institutions are? I guess that's my question. Reception.
Yeah, that's a good question. I guess certainly. I mean, as with all these kinds of genre definitions, they're very fluid and malleable. I think certainly around 1970, it was also a matter of kind of cultural distinction, whether one identified as like a free improviser or a jazz musician. And I think at that point, jazz was starting to be considered as something kind of old-fashioned. It was still being played very much on the radio and television, but it was kind of respectable, not very threatening jazz. And so I think also for a lot of the younger audience members, this kind of experimentation that improvised music provided would to them have been kind of something separate. But then you get into the kind of eternal questions of what is jazz, and then one person will say, well, this is actually, perpetuating what is truly essential about jazz, and another will say, no, it's really something different. So, yeah.
Okay, well, thank you. It does seem like your project is raising a lot of questions, and it provokes us to think about jazz and how we what we identify with it. Where do you see things? Where do you see your research going at this point? What are you working on?
Well, it's I mean, I'm developing a book proposal on the basis of this work, and so I guess one of the reasons that this was maybe a little bit overstuffed was that I was realizing that this was actually kind of trying to put the whole book into 20 minutes. But I mean, a large part of it, what I haven't really addressed today is more concerning kind of the historiography of jazz and how, especially Europe, plays a role in that. So there's been a longer argument for like a global jazz studies, and one of the things that I haven't really talked about is how thinking of colonial history and its very obvious and direct relation to the emergence of jazz gives a very different, kind of turns the whole idea of global jazz history on his head, so to speak. And also the role of Europe, obviously, in the history of jazz is turned on his head. But I think there might be some questions in the chat.
Yes,
well.
I see Sadie has, please go ahead.
Hi, thanks so much. That was really interesting. I'm very new to the subject matter. I wish I could go through your talk and like read through it and form a better question, but I hope this makes sense to you. In your talk, you're talking about idiom and discussing it in relation to language, which of course makes a lot of sense. But I was also thinking about idiom when you were talking when it comes to, let's say, physicality in the body. So like what's idiomatic for a pianist to do versus a violinist and so forth, right? You know, the kind of physical conditions of a particular instrument and how that shapes what a performer can play and what's considered idiomatic, right, on the instrument. So I guess I'm just curious, if you have any reflections about the body and physicality or that kind of side of the idiom, as opposed to language, but really interesting paper and gave me a lot to think about.
Thank you. Yes, well, I'm not sure if I have a direct answer, but one of the things that I've been thinking about is, so basically my argument was that Stiegler's subjects, which he calls Dasein in reference to Heidegger, is kind of this completely kind of disembodied, or at least there's no room for bodily differentiation. And I've been reading some of the work of Sara Ahmed on her work on the phenomenology of whiteness as a kind of comportment in space. This idea that which is quite strong within the phenomenological tradition of, my body knows all of these things without me having to consciously think about it. And she has a very interesting argument about how that kind of unawareness or that kind of tacit knowledge, or however you want to call it, is very much a white positionality. And kind of connecting that to some of the ideas about free improvisation, I think has been quite fruitful for me to kind of apply some of these ideas to the actual practice of improvising and to this idea of idiom being not just something that you can kind of develop in interaction with your technical or social context, but is also very much dependent on how you're being seen. And that's something that is, I think, largely missing from a lot of improvisation studies in general, I would argue.
Okay, thank you so much. August Sheehy has a question in the chat that I'll just read out. He says, thank you very much for your lucid analysis in this wonderful paper, ! As I always do when Bailey and non-idiomatic improvisation are brought up, I wonder about the idioms of non-idiomatic music. That is to say, to the extent that it constitutes an actual music practice and not simply a philosophical ideal. Does non-idiomatic improvised music create a positive language, even if that language must be continuously disavowed? One that does, in practice, perhaps constitute a rhetoric of whiteness.
Yes, thank you. I feel kind of obliged to say that I'm using Bailey as this kind of author figure. I don't really have any beef with Bailey himself, or like anyway. I more kind of use him as a kind of figure to express some ideas that I think are very much rooted in how a lot of people have thought about improvisation and especially the idea of freedom in improvisation. Of course. The short answer to your question is yes, and one of the things that I've kind of only very recently realized is how this idea of whiteness, especially in Western Europe and particularly in the Netherlands, must be understood within the kind of post-war situation and the kind of the trauma of the Second World War. So I mean, there's an obvious obvious relation to the whole idea of kind of the 0 hour aesthetic and that whole mentality. But there are also some of the musicians, for instance, Misha Mengelberg, who I mentioned in my paper as well. I only recently discovered that he should have been considered Jewish during German occupation, and for all sorts of reasons, kind of escaped that fate. So this idea of kind of idiom as a kind of dispossession, I'm still kind of working on how can I apply that to some of these white improvisers themselves. And for him, I kind of working through his past and his kind of heritage of classical music, having a famous great uncle Willem Mengelberg, who collaborated with the Nazis, kind of turning to improvisation as a way of kind of dealing with that that identity. That's something that I'm kind of working on. I'm not sure if that answers your question, but that's my answer.
August, if you want to jump in just to wrap things up, you're welcome to add a comment. I know.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, I guess I loved your paper. I'm interested in this question of idioms and the sort of rhetoric of whiteness. If there's a way to get around this problem of disavowal, to say, look, this is what the music actually sounds like. These are the kind of networks of signification that are invoked through the sound. In short, whether an analysis of the actual music produced is even possible. But yeah, thank you again. Love the paper.
I mean, yeah, thank you very much. The short answer is yes. And of course, idioms would in such analysis not be uniform, but very multiplicitous.
Great, thank you. We'll have to put a pin in that, but that's a conversation for the two of you for hopefully to continue in the future. So thank you, Floris. And we'll move to Sadie. Just give me 1 second. Okay, so I'm really excited to introduce Sadie Menicanin, who is a postdoctoral fellow in music and nature at the University of Oslo's Department of Musicology. She specializes in topics related to music and place, parks and gardens, and Vienna around 1900. And her work combines historical and interpretive approaches and is inflected by cross-disciplinary interests in sound studies and visual culture. Her work has been published in Music and Letters and the Musical Quarterly. She earned her PhD in musicology from the University of Toronto, supported by SCHURC, the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, and the Jackman Humanities Institute. Let's warmly welcome Sadie.
Thanks. Can you see my slide?
Yes, we are seeing the presenter view.
Oh, that's a pain.
Yeah.
You know what? I don't really know how to fix that. And I think
if you click on swap delays,
yeah, exactly.
That should do it for us.
Oh, you are wonderful. Thank you so much.
There you go. No problem.
Much appreciated. Thanks as well to Linda for chairing us today, and to the AMS organizers as well for having this online possibility, this option. Really appreciate it. Okay, so I'd like to begin together by looking at a couple of examples. The first is an illustrated title page to the popular song Wienerwald by Adolf Hirsch, which roughly dates to 1900. In the cover illustration, a path stretches before us into an inviting stand of trees. Just beyond and below, framed by an arched leafy canopy, is Vienna, identifiable by the silhouette of the Stephansdom and the curve of the Danube River. The second object is a song postcard, which also dates to around 1900. The card features the full melody and first verse of the song Die Luft vom Wienerwald by Hugo Schenk and Oskar Hoffmann from the early 1890s. A picturesque town tucked into a hilly landscape fills most of the card, but at the bottom left, a circular inset reveals a dense canopy of foliage surrounding the distant St. Stephen's Cathedral, stretching above a sea of rooftops. There lies Vienna. Each of these songs is about the Wienerwald, first and foremost. Pearse conveys the wood's beauty using sonic metaphors. He delights in what he refers to as the magical sound and glorious song of the woods, describes the branches' quiet whispers, and naturally he animates the tune in waltz time. Hoffmann's and Schenk's similarly waltzing song rejoices in spring and imitates bird calls in the Wienerwald's fragrant air. But another implicit presence in each of these songs is Vienna itself, as registered in their accompanying illustrations of the Stephansdom and in their waltz time, quite typical of sentimental popular songs about the city, Wienerlieder from the period. In celebrating the Wienerwald, then, both songs celebrate Vienna, a connection that's bolstered visually using views of the city that are only possible from the Wienerwald's hills. Similar views also circulated in non-music printed sources in this period. Consider, for example, Anton Lawacek's Ausblick vom Kallenberg, the opening illustration for the first volume of the Kronprinzenwerk, a massive official project sponsored by Crown Prince Rudolf, which aimed to document the lands, cultural practices, and peoples that made up the Austro-Hungarian monarchy. Prince Rudolf's introductory text for the first volume, which unfolds below this image, celebrates Vienna's God-given site nestled next to the Vienna woods. He regards this location specifically as decisive for the imperial capital's political, economic, and cultural greatness. The second example on the right is the title page illustration to a municipal pamphlet published in 1905 about the newly legislated Vienna Greenbelt project, showing the silhouetted Stephansdom set against a leafy border. As suggested by these official examples, the woods were essential to the canonization of a city iconography, which, according to Lutz Musna, had both a, quote, commemorative and image-forming, unquote, role, and rendered Vienna as both city and non-city, artificial and organic. This trope of Vienna, seen from the hills or framed by the trees of the Wienerwald, registers an interdependent relationship between city and woods, to which scholars outside musicology have paid greater attention. I appreciate Sandor Bekesi and Elke Doppler's recent formulation. They characterize the Wienerwald as Vienna's complementary landscape. The Wienerwald certainly offered an escape from turn-of-the-century industrial metropolitan Vienna, but the landscape was always conceptualized in relation to the city. As Bekesi and Doppler argue, the woods were in important ways constitutive of modern Vienna. A unique woods-city complementarity was invoked repeatedly in writings of local authors, who regarded Vienna as characterized by landscape. In a 1907 essay, for example, Hugo von Hofmannsthal likens Vienna to, quote, an enormous garden made up of thousands of small gardens and of wild garden-like hills, unquote. In his memoir, The World of Yesterday, Stefan Zweig recalled, quote, you hardly noticed where nature ended and the city began. They made way for one another without resistance or contradiction, unquote. And as observed by Max Graf, Vienna was set apart in that, quote, the surrounding woods are not merely a background, but belong to the city and are merged with it, end quote. As I'll show, a similar complementarity also emerges in conceptions of Vienna's musical identity as connected to its natural surroundings, which began to solidify around the turn of the century. So in this talk, I explore music's relationship to the Wienerwald at the intersection of several historical developments. First, Vienna's late 19th century urban transformations. Second, the flourishing of tourism in the Wienerwald. And third, the discursive and material construction of Vienna as a Musikstadt. Taking seriously the entanglements of symbolic and material aspects in cultural constructions of place, I value the contributions of music to the consolidation and circulation of popular ideas of the Wienerwald around 1900. Views of Vienna from an elevated prospect, especially the Kallenberg or Leopoldsberg, have been produced regularly at least since the 18th century. But depictions of Vienna from above saw a resurgence in the 1870s on. The newfound popularity of these views, Bacchesi and Doppler write, was related to the drastic transformations to Vienna's urban landscape in the later 19th century. This iconography represented an effort to visually capture the new Vienna and expressed a sense of pride in the rapidly modernizing city. Vienna's massive expansions in both area and population saw the incorporation of portions of the Wienerwald and nearby vineyards into the city limits, visible on this map by comparing the old green and the new red boundaries of the city. This map is from 1891. In the crowded metropolitan Vienna, noise and poor air quality were regarded as threats to urban dwellers' mental and physical well-being. Health and hygiene-related concerns lent urgency to ensuring easy access to green space, which was increasingly framed as a right for all social classes. The need for general access to parks was especially fraught in Vienna, since its large-scale urban renovations, the Ringstrasse construction, were predicated on the elimination of existing public green space, to a greater degree than that of cities like Paris. Recognition of the Wienerwald's primary use value for public recreation over its provision of material resources, or as land for residential development, emerged concurrently with these urban changes. In the early 1870s, a concerned citizen, Joseph Schuiling, spearheaded a press campaign against the sale of state-owned portions of the Wienerwald for development, managing to prevent massive deforestation after rallying public outcry. In 1886, the Wienerwald chapter of the Austrian Tourist Club was founded. It became one of the most active organizations for tourist development in the empire and a proving ground for bourgeois conservationist impulses. The Wienerwald chapter organized excursions, raised funds for building observation towers and monuments, such as the Habsburgwarte pictured here, maintained paths and path markings, and cultivated nature appreciation among members. Then, in 1905, the Wienerwald became the foundational component of the new municipal project for a green belt surrounding Vienna, which would be a model for other European capitals. This belt, which began with 6,000 hectares to the west and south of the city and was completed only after World War II, was protected from construction and functioned as a recreational site and, notably, an air reservoir for urban residents. Vienna's spatial expansion and the accompanying developments in transportation infrastructure rendered excursions to the Wienerwald much quicker and more accessible, which in turn facilitated the proliferation of the popular views back to the city, especially from the Kahlenberg. As put by art historian Taug Gronberg, the Wienerwald was thus, quote, both the means and the object of an urban gaze, unquote. Beginning in March 1874, the Kahlenberg was serviced by a rack and pinion train, or Zahnradbahn. By around 1900, this railway served between 160 to 190,000 passengers annually, almost half of which used it on Sundays and holidays. Although tourism was expanding across the empire, the largest number of excursionists were concentrated in the areas closest to Vienna. As the Wienerwald became more and more popular for day trips, following 1900, peaking by around 1914, complaints about tourist behavior or excursionist behavior were raised in publications like the Wienerwaldbote and the Austrian Tourist Club newspaper. Overcrowding, littering, and noisiness were frequently cited as growing problems. A 1910 article, for instance, complains of loud music and noise from gramophones as pervasive disturbances on formerly quiet Sundays in the woods. Meanwhile, between the 1870s and 1914, the notion of a Musikstadt became a central self-identity and marketing image for Vienna, a powerful idea that still dominates tourism rhetoric today. In her wonderful book, Musikstadt Wien, Martina Nussbaumer traces the gradual consolidation of this idea, which reached an apex by around 1910 across multiple material and discursive formats. These registers included monuments dedicated to composers, new illustrious buildings for musical institutions, multi-day music festivals, the naming of streets after important figures, and the circulation of influential ideas in tourist guides. Contemporary tourist guidebooks like the Baedeker and the Ciceroni included prose distilling the cultural character of their target cities and offered sightseeing recommendations. Unsurprisingly, a trip up to the Kallenberg was frequently highlighted as a must-do excursion for visitors to Vienna. Nussbaumer identifies a core group of recurring arguments in such travel guides and closely related cultural historical literature that were leveraged to explain Vienna's apparently innate association with music. These were founded on a circular logic. Authors cite Vienna's illustrious musical heritage as evidence and make essentialist arguments about the inherent musicality of both the Viennese folk and of the city's surrounding landscape and physical location. Although Nussbaumer does not develop this specific angle in her already very rich book, the Wienerwald is often mentioned as a source of musical inspiration in such written sources, or described poetically as itself a sonoric landscape that generated the necessary conditions for Vienna to be a Musikstadt. Take the following example from Hermine Klote's 1912 collection of essayistic tours around Vienna and area. In one essay, she figures Johann Strauss II's beautiful blue Danube as a musical manifestation of Vienna, of the Danube River, and indeed of the city's specific location and landscape. She states outright that it could not have been composed anywhere but a city surrounded by this river and these wooded hills. These kinds of essentializing ideas were not limited to cultural, historical, or tourist literature. Other journalistic writing also ascribed creative inspirational powers to the Wienerwald and even more particularly to the air of the woods. Consider this illustrative quote from 1921 reproduced in Louis Mosner's Der Geschmack von Wien. "A very strange magical air blows from the heights of the Vienna woods. The childlike joy of the Viennese in nature has become proverbial, no less his receptivity to music, for which the nature around Vienna seems so beneficial that every musician gets his inspiration from the Vienna woods. It's no wonder then that Vienna is so renowned as a Musikstadt, since every Viennese breathes music with the air, so to speak." Celebrated music critics Eduard Hanslick and Julius Korngold each also referenced the influence of the Wienerwald on the creative outputs of Beethoven and Brahms. Neither composer was native-born Viennese, but they were naturalized as Viennese artists, in part by way of their affinity with the Vienna woods. Similarly, on the unveiling of the Lanner and Strauss monument in the Rathaus Park, the author of an account in the Fremdenblatt similarly remarked on the influence of the Wienerwald's enchanted murmuring and rustling on the two composers' works. Here again, the Wienerwald, and specifically its air, is figured as innately sonic and musical, an image that's echoed in contemporary song lyrics like Hirsch's Wienerwald, and that also upholds deterministic arguments construing Vienna as a Musikstadt in connection to its local landscape. Vienna's popular music industry also played an essential role in materializing the city's music-associated identity. This phenomenon can be traced through the works of the Strauss family, Johann Schrammel, and numerous other contemporaries writing operetta and sentimental Wienerlieder and so forth. Famously, the Strausses often celebrated urban life in Vienna and referenced topical subject matter in their works. As evident from my opening song examples and this cover image of a Johann Schrammel march, note again the view, Viennese subjects were not the exclusive remit of the Strausses. But nonetheless, David Wynne Jones notes how this Vienna specificity became a key part of the Strausses' aesthetic, earning them local devotion and helping render their sound, especially the waltzes, as an acoustic signature of Vienna itself. This identification is clear in the civil portrait of Strauss II, depicted floating above the city, seen from a view, again, from the Kallenberg or Leopoldsberg. The appreciation of the Strauss waltz as iconic of Vienna quickly solidified into a popular cliché, evident in Hermine Klote's 1912 essay I quoted earlier, and in the following more nostalgic excerpt from Max Graf's Legend of a Musical City. Graf writes that Strauss's waltzes, quote, contained all of Vienna, the gaiety, the laughter, the love, the beautiful women, wine, and song, the landscape, woods, and streams. Less often programmatic in content, the Strauss's musical works mainly referenced extra musical topics through titles and cover illustrations. Take a look at this title page of Eduard Strauss's Wien über alles. It shows a view of the cog railway leading to the Kallenberg and the Leopoldsberg in the distance. The polka is a musical greeting to praise and flatter Vienna, composed by Eduard on return to the city after a long absence on tour. The piece is hardly about the Zahnradbahn, nor does it portray the railroad in any sonic sense, but nonetheless, this cover illustration associates the musically figured city with its beloved local mountains and the new popular means of getting up them. Taken together, the title and the title page illustration reinforce the notion of the city as forming a complementary unit with the Wienerwald, though here depicted from an unusual perspective opposite to the examples I've shown so far, from the city and towards the woods. Another Strauss work makes a noteworthy connection between city and woods. To mark Vienna's 1891-92 expansion through the amalgamation of its suburbs, Johann II composed a series of waltzes titled Groß Wien. Originally only instrumental, the waltzes were soon texted by Franz von Gernert. One of the verses dwells at length on the metropolis's improved access to green space, especially to the Wienerwald, which filled a need that the Prater, Vienna's largest public park, alone could not. Here, the Wienerwald and even the Zahnradbahn are cited as constitutive of modern metropolitan Vienna. The Wienerwald is integral to what makes Groß Wien worth celebrating. Musicologists have devoted almost no sustained critical attention to the Wienerwald, despite, or perhaps because, of the plethora of anecdotes and cliches concerning music and this landscape. The few sources that exist are very cursory. Some take a list-like approach to a smattering of musical works spanning over a century that are related to the Wienerwald without almost any contextualization. Most dwell on representative pieces like Strauss Jr.'s 1868 waltzes, Geschichten aus dem Wienerwald, as a primary example. Sources commonly and reductively focus on artists and composers that took inspiration from the woods, taking summer holidays there, hiking, and writing famous pieces that, it's often argued, bear some kind of trace of the landscape. Such tropes solidified around 1900 in the likes of Hermine Klote's essay collection and other tourist guides, but are also found in song lyrics like Schenks and Hoffmann's Die Luft vom Wienerwald. They also continue to be rehearsed in more recent writings like Paul Hoffmann's 1994 The Spell of the Vienna Woods and Anton Riede's popular geographical overview and cultural history, Der Wienerwald. So in my ongoing research, I'm departing from prevailing accounts of music and the Wienerwald as a story only about composers, or about tracing musical inspiration to specific locations, or identifying musical elements as forest-like. My project instead is to situate diverse musical engagements with the Wienerwald, like waltzes, song lyrics, illustrated musical objects, in their urban and environmental contexts, and to analyze entrenched cliches in light of historical realities. In the case of the Wienerwald, I suggest one really shouldn't take for granted that these music and these woods become indelibly associated during the very turn of the century period that Vienna begins to construct itself as a Musikstadt in institutional, civic, and commemorative terms. Moreover, the idyllic portrayals of the Wienerwald in turn of the century popular song were often a far cry from the realities of the increasingly popular suburban retreat, whose most accessible spots by 1910 were becoming overcrowded by the masses using quick urban rail to seek the wood's restorative mental and physical benefits. The intertwinement between woods and city, borne out in the visual trope of the Stephansdom viewed through a frame of trees, was circulated in official documents that crafted Vienna's and the empire's self-image, as well as in musical objects that traded in a common musical and visual imaginary of place. The Wienerwald was vital to what made Vienna a model metropolis around 1900, and was also repeatedly framed through a nostalgic and at times anti-urban lens as both the inspiration and the justification for Vienna as Musikstadt. These ideas about the Wienerwald and music arose at a particular time under specific circumstances and indeed during much rapid and drastic change. And it's by recognizing the contextual background for these tropes that we can better make sense of and appreciate the meaning-making capacity of Viennese popular music and music's utility in broader cultural discourses of landscape and place.
Wow, thank you, Sadie. That's a really wonderful, wonderful paper. And you're getting lots of applause. That's nice. Yeah, so I'd just like to open the floor to questions, and I'll give them a few seconds, and then I have my own questions. Having walked up the Kallenberg myself, I can fully situate myself in your paper. Okay, so I guess I'll just launch in. Yeah, I'm curious about sort of your take on the role of the nostalgic imaginary of urbanites, which sort of ran wild in the woods, and its connection to the rigorous period of social change and political change in which this occurred. I mean, you mentioned it at the very end, but I'm wondering if this is like, do you see this as some kind of escape mechanism for people who are dealing with a world that's kind of out of control or changing rapidly, or the pressures of urban life are making things congested, and so this fantasy of the woods being part of their identity, is that an antidote to that stress? Do you see that, or please just elaborate?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. There's a lot that spins out from this. This project is still underway, I will say. I'm still researching it, but the more I'm finding, the more things spin off from it. So for instance, I'm coming across repeatedly sources that are framing the woods as part of the metropolitan experience of Vienna, what makes Vienna such an admirable city. So like the woods are kind of not necessarily set apart from the city, but they're part of it. So I keep finding sources that reinforce that. The other thing is, though, that green belt was explicitly two of its main goals that were explicitly stated in the municipal pamphlet are, one, to provide an air reservoir, because there was a lot of anxiety around air quality. So it's specifically an airy landscape. So air quality is a main one, and then also nature appreciation, but like the aesthetic benefits of being out in nature. So having a pleasant kind of aesthetic experience. Those were the two main kind of reasons that the city gave behind the green belt and its value. With that said, though, access to nature was really important and was advertised as important for working classes who had very little access to parks in Vienna around this time in the districts that they lived in, and so were often getting out into the woods more. However, then those classes are the kind of objects of criticism over not behaving properly in the woods. And there's a lot of funny complaints that are published in various newspapers about the wildlings, even that term is used, who are throwing cigarette butts and picking flowers and making noise and so on and so forth. But the final, again, flip of that is that there is obviously some music making that is sanctioned in the woods, because there's evidence of hiking songbooks that are also published from like the 1880s. So I'm really interested in all of these kind of like conflicting registers of, yeah, what's happening here? Why are the woods important? Who are they accessible to? What music is allowed there? Is the woods rural? Is it urban? And so on and so forth. So there's a lot of like layered things going on. Yeah.
Yeah, that is really interesting. So the songbooks that are published, those are going to not be for the working class, is that right? Or would those be accessible to the working class at this time? I guess that's kind of
That's a great question. The trouble is, it's been hard to track down some of these books that I have found mentioned in the Tourist Club newspaper. I've looked for some of them. That said, there was a socialist kind of like Friends of Nature club that was an alternative to the Austrian Tourist Association, that they were founded in 1895. They also published their own songbooks. I assume that would have been more accessible to working class people, that organization. I think the Austrian Tourist Club would have been a little bit more bourgeois. So I found a songbook from the Friends of Nature, but it was much later. It was like from the 1930s. I haven't been able to track down their earlier one, unfortunately.
And to what extent are the songbooks sort of elite controlled? You know, the people actually creating the songbooks, are they transmitting messages of the empire through them, like noble values that the empire wants to disseminate, or where, who are the writers of these? Are there just can you talk about that relationship?
That's a great question, and I don't know, unfortunately, because I haven't been able to find some of these songbooks. I have not been able to track down. I've been able to look into a couple of them. and at least see a table of contents or something, or a suggestion of what's there, like the ones that exist that are a little bit later that I can only extrapolate, like what that they might kind of be similar to the ones from decades before. But some of them do have this kind of more German nationalist, like Vaterland kind of like themes. Some of them don't. And so there's almost like thematic sections, let's say, to the song. One of the postcards that I showed, though, that had a melodic incipit, was produced by a highly German nationalist organization, the Deutsche Schulverein. So it's interesting because I know not all musical inflections of the Wienerwald have kind of German nationalist subtext, but some of them certainly did. So it was interesting to see that postcard circulated by this Deutsche Schulverein, kind of with a melodic incipit attached that shows a lot of people would have known that song, but then that the Vienna Woods can then be kind of embraced within this broader Germanic forest symbolism, which that's not always the case.
Oh, that's really interesting. Wow, I will be looking forward to seeing how your research unfolds. I'm really interested in that songs component, and yeah. Anyways, okay. Well, we should wrap up. Wait a minute. Do we have a question? There we go. Floris is asking, is there a gender dimension to how the Wienerwald is conceptualized? What a wonderful question.
Yeah. If I could just, it's a really wonderful project, and I really love this idea of kind of having this kind of internal other, kind of the nature and the urban and the nature being kind of this constant point of discussion. So I just wondered, you mentioned class differences, and I wondered, it seems like this really suitable kind of figure to kind of look at all kinds of how all kinds of binaries are constructed on the basis of this kind of urban nature dimension.
That's a really good question, and I haven't quite. I mean, all the composers that are the people mentioned as finding inspiration and so on and so forth, poets and artists and what have you, they're all men. So that is the one way that gender has expressed itself most kind of acutely in this project, let's say. But otherwise, I haven't found much that gives me much of an answer there. I mean, I think like, yeah, I haven't found as much as I would have liked. I think the artists that repeatedly are the ones being inspired are men. And I mean, otherwise, you do see in a lot of these imagery, you see a lot of couples and sort of there's sort of, heterosexual couples going out, and it's sort of being this outdoor romancing sort of spot, let's say. So there's often these kind of comedic lovers tropes in the woods and so on. But apart from that, I haven't done enough digging to uncover anything else. But it's a really good question. I want to keep my eyes peeled for that.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you. What a wonderful conversation. And I'd like to thank our three panelists, Floris and Eric and Sadie, for wonderful talks. And you've left us with a lot to ponder. And yeah, so I'll end things there and say, let's just thank our speakers.
Thanks so much for sharing this, Linda.
Thanks, Linda. Thank you.
And thanks to everyone who attended. Thanks for your questions.